This happened to me when I was 13, and it's something I've never forgotten. We had just moved into a brand new house in a brand new housing development. A lot of the houses around us were either unfinished or had families that had just moved in. Behind our house was a lot of field, mostly for more future houses. We lived in a fairly safe small city and the housing development was very quiet, so for the first few years we lived there, we never bothered to lock the doors. Even at night, most of the time, it just wasn't something we thought about. My parents had just put in hardwood floor, so the house was a pretty echoey single story. One night, as I was laying in bed trying to fall asleep, I thought I heard the back sliding glass door open. I was up late on the internet, but everyone else was asleep, so the house was quiet. I had my doors slightly open so my cat could come and go, and so I knew that I was definitely hearing something. I froze, hoping it wasn't the door, but a moment later I heard it slide shut. Then I began to hear what sounded like heavy shoes walking across the hardwood floor. It was a very specific sound, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. The footsteps were slow and quiet, like they were trying to make as little noise as possible, but because the floor was wood and our house had high ceilings, the steps echoed down the hallway to my room. Then I heard them stop, the sound of the hallway closet being opened, and then the door quietly clicking shut, like they turned the knob, pulled the door closed, and then released the knob once it was in place. It was silent after that. My heart was beating so fast that I began crying. The only way to my parents' room was up the hallway. Their door was only about 20 feet away from where that hallway closet was. I was frozen, and I honestly thought I would pee my pants, as I was so scared. However, it was silent for long enough that I knew I had to get to my dad. So I stood up and walked sock-footed to my door. I stood there for a long time breathing. Then I ran. It's not a long hallway, but I went as fast as I could. I got inside their room and tried to wake my dad up. "Dad! Dad!" I was frantically whispering.
Huh?
He was half asleep.
Dad! Huh? What?
"Dad, I think there's someone inside the house."
What?
"Get up, I think there's someone inside the house."
There's no one in here. Go back to sleep.
"Yes, there is." I start crying at this point. That gets him up. My mum also wakes up at this point as well, so they both get out of bed. My dad, sure that there is no one in the house, doesn't even grab something as a weapon, but I follow behind him as he leaves the room. He goes into the living room, passes the closet, turns on all the lights in the house, and I remember standing in the living room, knowing exactly where the person was and not being able to say anything. He tells me to look. There's no one. He doesn't check the closet though, and I don't tell him to. I'm so afraid that whoever is in there will jump out with a knife and kill my dad in front of me, and 13-year-old me keeps thinking that I can't be the one responsible for my dad's death. So I say nothing, and I don't tell him to check the closet. I don't know why he didn't, because if I were a dad, I would have. He locks the front door and tells him to go back to bed. They wait until I'm back in my room before they close their own bedroom door and go back to sleep. Again, the house is silent, and I am laying there afraid because that person is still in here in the one place that he didn't look. Suddenly, I hear the closet door open, just as slowly and as quietly as before. Then the footsteps again. I could hear them so clearly walking towards the kitchen where the back door is, and they stop. That's followed by the sound of the back door being slid open and then quietly being pushed closed again. I hear the back door click into place, and then the house is silent. I'm laying there crying and breathing, but hearing them leave the house, I felt instant relief, though I was still shaking with fear. I give it a few minutes hoping that they wouldn't come back, and they don't. So after a bit, I sneak out there. My one and only thought is to lock the back door, which I managed to do. But the scariest part was that when I looked at the hall closet, the door wasn't closed anymore, and it was cracked because they hadn't bothered to close it after they left, though I knew it was definitely closed when my dad was out here with me. I tried bringing it up to them years later and they still didn't believe me, but that's not something you just hear. This just happened earlier tonight, and I thought I might share because I'm pretty shaken up over it. Earlier, at around 10:30 PM, I took my dog outside since he was whining at the door. I usually take him around this time and live in a nice, quiet neighborhood, so I'm usually not too worried about being out late. I've taken him out around midnight before, no problem. Tonight I was home alone waiting for my boyfriend to get home from work, so I was a little on edge already because I am a generally paranoid person. I read this sub a lot and try to take extra precautions to avoid the situations a lot of you have been in, so I took my pocket knife outside with me like I always do late at night. When I step outside, I do an area scan right outside my door just to see if there's anyone else out. Well, anyways, I took my pup out and he walks towards a tree to do his business. Then, within a few seconds, starts barking insistently. I was freaked because I had already scanned the whole outside area and determined no one else was around, but he was barking as if someone was there. Now, my dog almost always barks at everyone, so that in itself wasn't weird, but since I was on high alert and hadn't noticed anyone, I sensed something was off. I hesitantly walked around to where he is and see nothing, but I have a death grip on my knife and feel a little safer, though I probably would never ever have the guts to use it. My dog was still going crazy at seemingly nothing, so I told him to shut up and thinking that maybe he just saw a cat or a squirrel or something like that. I keep my attention focused on that area, but start backing up towards my door just in case, but my dog was still pulling in the opposite direction, barking like all hell. I decided that he wasn't going to do his business, so I figured I'd just take him back in and try again once my boyfriend came from work. But then I saw something move in my peripherals in the same direction my dog was barking. When I turned to get a better look, I noticed there was a person crouched between some cars directly outside my neighbor's apartment across the street, not moving. I could barely see them, but could see the shoes peeking out from underneath a car. My dog was growling at this point and standing his ground in front of me, but I didn't particularly feel safe since my dog is a small wiener dog who no one is afraid of because of how cute he is, even if his bark is big. In that moment I kinda froze and tried to tell my dog to be quiet, but quietly, like I just didn't want to be noticed, but there is no way whoever was by the cars didn't know we were there. My flight mechanism kicked in real soon though, and I managed to pull my dog away back into my apartment and immediately locked my door behind me. I turned off all the lights, let my dog off his leash, then went to the window that faced where the person was crouched and peeked out. My heart missed a beat when a rather large male came out from behind the car and started walking towards my place. Now, my door has 2 floor-to-ceiling narrow windows on either side of it with no curtains, so anyone can just look in and see my living room or kitchen depending on their angle, but couldn't see where I was by my other window because of furniture. My pup was barking again at the window, and I knew this guy was looking in, but couldn't bring myself to look. Then, I heard my door handle jiggling slightly. Mind you, I'm like 10 feet away from the door. My phone was upstairs in my room, so I couldn't do anything like call the police unless I wanted to give away my hiding space. Eventually, after what seemed like forever, but in actuality maybe a couple of minutes, my dog got quiet and ran back to me. I guess the guy left after finding out my door was locked. Maybe he thought I didn't see him outside? I don't know, and I certainly don't want to know what his intentions were, but I'm glad that my dog alerted me so I didn't have to find out. This happened about 6 months ago. I was 22 at the time, and my daughter was only 4. I lived in a 2-story house with just me, my daughter and my husband. I was taking at-home classes to be an iPhone specialist, starting at 5 PM and ending at 10 PM Monday to Friday. My husband had left for his 2 weeks of training he does every year for the military, so it's just me, my daughter, and our pitbull mix, Mavis. I had just finished my classes for the week and had the weekend free, so I decided to go to my mother's house until Sunday. So I packed up my stuff and my daughter's stuff as well, and we went for the weekend. We returned home Sunday to find someone had broken into our home. There are muddy footprints and windows open, but nothing was missing. I was going to call the police, but my sister's husband explained that the cops wouldn't do anything. Nothing happened that night, but the next day, my mother came over to pick my daughter up so I could do my classes without worrying what she was up to. They left, and I went to watch the class upstairs. I put headphones on so I can hear my instructor teach the class, but I swear I keep hearing stuff downstairs. I even texted my mum and told her that I heard stuff downstairs and it was creeping me out. But she assured me that it was probably just Mavis because everything was locked up tight and no one could get in. I agreed, thinking that I was probably just freaking myself out. I continued listening to my instructor teach, and I swear I heard footsteps on the stairs, so I hurry up and take my headset off and listen. I didn't hear anything. I walked down the stairs and didn't see anything either, so I went back to class. At 10 PM, my class was over, and my mum decided to just keep my daughter for the night. I was doing homework with Mavis upstairs with me, and all of a sudden she started barking and growling and ran downstairs. Now, Mavis usually barks and growls at the slightest noise outside, so I didn't think much of it but decided that I should check it out anyway because of what happened while I was at my mother's. Again, nothing out of the ordinary, so I went back upstairs. I was finally done with homework and it's about midnight, so I went downstairs and called my mum like I do every night. We were talking and I decided I opened my daughter's door and peeked my head in. I don't know why I did this because my daughter was at my mum's for the night, just a habit I guess. I should have mentioned earlier that when you look into my daughter's room, her bed is on the far wall a good ways away from the door, so you can clearly see under her bed. I opened the door and to my horror, a man was under her bed. I just froze and didn't move, just stood there in shock. After what felt like minutes, I slowly shut the door and whispered into the phone to my mum that there is a man in my house under my daughter's bed. My mum was terrified and she screamed at me to get outside and to stay on the phone with her as she got my brother to call the police, so I ran outside with Mavis and waited for the police to arrive. About 3 minutes later, they came and searched my house and found no one, but they discovered my bathroom window was open and they happened to shine their light at the living room window, and I could clearly see 2 huge handprints where they slid the window down. The cops waited for my mum and brother to get there, and while we're waiting, they told me about this man that usually stays 2 houses down from mine with his parents. Both of his parents have a pretty bad drug habit, and this guy has been known to put women in the hospital and try and kill them. What scares me even more is since we have bought this house, my daughter has been terrified and always told my mum that she wanted to stay with her because it wasn't safe at mummy's house. I didn't think too much of it because I thought maybe it was just a new place, and you know how kids are with new places. After this whole thing happened, I stayed with my mum until my husband came home. We decided to ask our daughter about the house, and what she told me absolutely terrified me. She said that at night, while her dad and I slept, monsters came to her window and tried to get in. She says it's a boy and a girl monster. The next day we installed alarms on all the windows and security lights. I can't stop questioning why. Why was this man under my daughter's bed? Was he waiting for me to go to sleep? Was he waiting for my mum to bring my daughter back home and I put her to bed? I get sick to my stomach thinking about what could have happened. I don't know why the man just stayed still under the bed, but maybe he thought that I didn't see him. I'm just glad that he didn't. I'm a small female living alone in a large city. Knowing exactly what this could mean for me, I'm pretty wary of my surroundings and the people in it. I recently moved to the back of an apartment complex to the 3rd floor, which I was very excited about since I hate being on ground level. A few days after moving in, I met my across the way neighbor, Steve. Steve was tall and skinny with dark hair and the tryings of a beard. He was nice, polite in a few passings, but we never had more than an exchange of a few hellos until one Saturday night. My friend dropped me off at my place late that night, and I stumbled up the stairs stupid drunk. I knew I was making a racket because Steve opened his door as I approached mine. I waved at him and smiled as I fumbled for my keys. I was facing my door, trying to remember which key it was, as they all looked the same, and I felt Steve come up behind me. He grabbed my hand with the keys and breathed, "Let me help," and immediately found the correct key and helped me put it into the keyhole. It could have been romantic looking back if this guy hadn't proceeded to stick his nose into my hair and take a deep, shaky breath. The red alarms immediately started going off in my head and cut through my drunken stupor. My breath was frozen in my throat, and I realized just how fucked I could possibly be. "Thanks," I mumbled before slipping through my door and locking it behind me. I stood there for a moment going, "What the fuck?" when I heard a soft thump on the other side of the door. I slowly turned and looked through the peephole, but I couldn't see anything, only blackness, which didn't make any sense because there was a light outside which kept the stairs lit. I blinked and stepped back before checking again. This time, I saw Steve backing away from the peephole. My body felt like it was drunken in ice water. Steve went back into his apartment and I didn't hear anything else that night. For a few weeks after that, I would hear the same soft thump and find Steve trying to peer into my apartment from the peephole. I could hear his heavy breathing. Sometimes he would even paw at the door, but he never came out when I would come home after that first night. I never called the cops. I probably should have, but Steve was my neighbor, and I didn't want to stir up any animosity that I would have to deal with later. Steve moved out 2 weeks ago. This story happened about 2 years ago while I was in university working on my degree in biology. I had signed up for a trip to gather samples for an experiment some students in the ecology department were going to run. It required the collection of samples from several sites, so they recruited biology, ecology and forestry majors to help them complete the sampling in a shorter period. The area where my group was to take samples from was a few hours from my uni in the Pacific Northwest. There are 9 of us in my group, 8 students and a supervising professor. We got to the campsite in the late evening and set up our tents. One of the other students had brought a big container of split pea soup from home and was sharing it with the others on the trip. I didn't really care for split pea soup, so I declined the offer. Everyone had some except me, one other student, and the professor. Come the next morning, the 5 students who had eaten the soup weren't in the best of shape. They were in the grips of some gnarly food poisoning and were in no shape to hike for the 8 or 9 hours to collect the samples we needed. The professor who was supervising us originally had some rules, such as people travel in groups of at least 2 people, and we had to return to camp by nightfall. Now, those rules were tossed out to make sure that we kept our timetable and collected all of the required samples. We were just told to do your best to complete the work assigned, as long as you can do it safely. That morning, I set out for a long day of hiking, and after a mile or so, I ran into the stream I was supposed to follow. I needed to travel about 4 miles upstream, stopping every quarter mile to collect samples of the water and soil. This meant that I had to hustle to get back before dark. Halfway through the day, I realized that wasn't going to happen. About 2 miles into my hike, I stopped for lunch, sitting on a log overlooking the stream. The scene was really peaceful until I smelled a cigarette. It wasn't the smell of a cigarette being smoked, more the musty smell of a heavy smoker's car, where cigarette butts have been left to ferment for weeks on end. I looked around, but couldn't see anyone. I just assumed that the wind had blown the scent of some hunter or hiker over to me, but minutes later the smell hadn't faded. The vegetation in the area wasn't that thick, but there was still a lot of places for someone to duck behind a tree or a bush. I was unnerved that someone was apparently staying close enough to me for me to smell them for this long without so much as a word. I quickly packed up the trash from my lunch and continued up the stream. The musty cigarette smell went away for the next few hours. It wasn't until I arrived at my last sample location late into dusk that I smelled it again. The woods were getting really dim by this point. Looking back on it, it was a really stupid idea to stay out so late, as just hiking back to camp in the dark would be pretty dangerous, even without a cigarette smoking stalker. Having just put the collection tubes in my bag, I shined my flashlight around the darkening woods looking for whoever was giving off the smell. I didn't see anything that caught my attention. It would actually be more correct to say that I saw too many things in the dim light that might have been a head sticking out from behind a tree or someone crouched low in the foliage. I didn't like the idea of being in the dark woods with a stranger who for the second time was lurking near me without revealing themselves, so I began to double time it back down the stream. I made much better time on my way back, even though it was getting dark, because I didn't have to stop to take any samples. Even so, I didn't get back to camp till a bit before 10. I was the last one to get back and everyone but the professor was already asleep. I didn't mention the cigarette smell to the professor because he seemed tired as it was, and he headed to his bed in the RV soon after I got back. I headed to my tent soon after. At some point in the night, I woke up needing to pee. I decided to head into the woods to do my business, as I knew some of the other students were still feeling ill and needed the RV toilet for some urgent matters than just having to take a leak. I walked about 100 feet into the woods, found a tree, and did what I needed to do. As I turned to go back to camp, something caught my eye. Somewhere off in the woods, there was a tiny red glow. I was confused as to what it was until it flared momentarily, and I realized it was the cherry of a cigarette. I stood there for a while, watching the red ember glow, fade, then move slightly closer to the ground as whoever was smoking would take it out of their mouth. Not being able to see the person, I assumed they were watching the camp. I didn't know if they had seen me make my way into the woods or not, as the fire had been doused and the moon was only half full, so there wasn't very much light. I made my way slowly back to camp as quietly as I could and entered the RV to wake up the professor. I told him about the person smoking in the woods and about the smell of cigarettes earlier that day. However, when we got outside the RV, the ember from the cigarette was gone. My professor woke the other student who hadn't come down with food poisoning, and we took turns watching over the camp. I didn't see or smell anything else when I was on guard duty and went to sleep when the professor woke up for his turn. In the morning, the professor, the other student, and I went to where I guessed the smoker had been standing the night before, and sure enough we found about 10 cigarette butts on the ground next to a tree. The tree itself looked like someone had been twisting and stabbing a knife or other sharp object into it, as the bark and outer layers of wood had been damaged and chipped away. The professor decided that the group should head back that day, even though we hadn't collected all of the samples that we were assigned, to be on the safe side. We packed up camp and drove down the thin dirt trail without incident. The second we got onto the paved highway though, a white paneled van pulled out of a clearing just off the shoulder and began following us. This van stayed behind us all the way back, pulling off the highway when we did, taking the same surface streets that we did, and only stopped following us when we turned onto the road leading to our university campus. Everyone was freaked out by this, but it was around 9 at night on a weekend, so the security office on campus was closed. We decided to unload the RV and call it a night, as the van hadn't followed us onto campus. I offered to help the professor catalogue and store the collection tubes from our trip. So it was another couple of hours before I left the biological sciences building and started heading towards the dorm building that I lived in. I stepped out into the cool night air and began walking, my professor having left the building in the other direction to get to his car and drive home. It was a couple of dozen feet outside of the building, which was now locked, when I was hit with the musty smell of old cigarettes. I looked around, and about 25 yards in the darkness off of the footpath, I saw the cherry of a cigarette smouldering away. I was pretty scared at this point, but I hoped it was only a student or some faculty staying late having a smoke. I couldn't completely convince myself of this, as the musty cigarette smell was the same as what I smelled in the woods the previous night. I started down the footpath and soon passed whoever was smoking. 100 feet or so later, I looked over my shoulder and saw the cigarette cherry in the darkness, and the smoker was following me. This creeped me out a bit more, but I still held it together. This is until I rounded a small stand of trees and saw a white panelled van parked alone in a parking lot. I took off at a sprint towards my dorm building. I looked over my shoulder, and a few steps into my run, I saw the cherry of the cigarette fall to the ground and a dark shape beginning to move after me. I didn't look back again, but I could hear someone running in the grass off of the footpath. I got to the entrance to my dorm building and frantically waved my keycard in front of the card reader that controlled the door lock. And as soon as I heard the soft beep, I opened the door, jumped through the doorway, and shut the door quickly. I stepped and peered through the glass door. I saw the dark shape stop just short of the lit pathway. I just watched for a minute or two. Then I saw the spark of a lighter. The light is just barely bright enough to illuminate a shaggy beard and brim of a baseball cap before it disappears and was replaced with the red glow of a cigarette. I turned and headed up the stairs to my dorm room. By the time I get to my window overlooking the same yard I had just run through, there is no entrance of a dark figure or a cigarette cherry. After that, I didn't see that white panel van again, or smell that musty cigarette smell. And I hope I never do. I started working at my current summer part-time job last spring. I'm situated in a large building that used to be a country club, but fell into disrepair about 10 years ago. Although there is nothing paranormal about my story, it is maybe worth mentioning that the former manager committed suicide in the main office upstairs when they went out of business. It adds to the unsettling quality of this place. Along with that, so do the seemingly never-ending hallways and passages, numerous hidey holes and half-empty pools, and other strange unused parts of the building like a secret shower room / a sauna, and a tunnel of storage areas that connect the men's and women's bathrooms. There are also a lot of doors to the outside in this place. It makes sense for a country club, but currently we only use one small room for the golf course check-in, the kitchen, and one dining room for the restaurant upstairs, and the small cafe area for early morning golfers to get their coffee and beer. The cafe area is where I work. In the summer, we clock in to open the cafe before 6 AM, often before the sun comes up. The golf course people come in pretty shortly after, but I would be the first person in the building every morning. I would unlock the front door, disarm the alarm, walk downstairs in the dark, unlock this cage that keeps the drunkies at the bar upstairs at night from wandering downstairs, and crawl along a very long, dark hallway with no windows to get to the light switch at the end of the hall. This always creeps me out, and I end up holding my keys between my fingers like brass knuckles, and ninja sliding down the walls on the opposite side of whatever doorway is coming up, just because it's pitch black and I'm a scaredy bear. By the time I get to the end of the hall, I flip the light on. My heart is always pounding out of my chest as I struggle to find the right key to let me into the cafe. The whole situation started when Tim, a golf course employee, mentioned that he kept shutting the door between the men's locker room / bathroom and the storage area that leads to the women's, and every time he would come back in there, it would be open again. This, along with some strange noises, was enough for the bar regulars upstairs to claim this place was haunted by the old manager and whomever else they say died within these halls. Travis, a co-worker in the cafe, also mentioned that a few minutes after he opened, he went into the men's locker room and noticed that it was steamy and smelled like soap. So he went into the shower room to investigate, and everything was soaping wet and still hot. He was the only person who was supposed to be there at that time of day, but didn't see anyone else, so he let it go. A couple of months later, Tim noticed this weird side door that you had to climb up a rickety old staircase on the side of the building, and it wasn't shutting correctly. He fixed it and locked it correctly and didn't think anything more of it. Shortly afterwards, someone from the golf course came over to tell them that they found someone's entire life packed away in one of their hundreds of lockers that no one uses, and they thought that someone was living in the storage room between the men's and women's bathrooms. He must have been coming in before the golf course people set the alarms when they left in the evenings, and leaving after the cafe person, that being me, would come in and turn off the alarm in the morning. So that means that every morning, as I blindly shuffled my way down that long, dark hallway alone, one of those pitch black doorways actually did have someone hiding behind it. A few days later, a red-faced, angry, bold man in Vietnam-era army and issue glasses came into the cafe and started screaming, puffing and flailing his arms around, yelling about his stuff getting thrown out. He went over to berate the golf course people, so they asked him about the contents of the locker. His answers about specific items led them to realize this was the man who was secretly living in one of this building's many dark passageways. I never found out much about him, whether he was dangerous or just homeless, but watching him scream about his stuff made it clear that he wasn't 100% rational. I still work there and do a darkness shuffle down the hall every morning when I work, and although they say everything is on the up and with the alarms and the doors locking, it still creeps me the hell out. Monday, I noticed a pad of paper and a long metal pair of tweezers clipped underneath the stairs. I thought it probably had something to do with inventory because right before, a manager came in to count our foodstuffs and beverages. Also, it wasn't an area that is easily accessed by customers, but not technically locked in any way during the day. Today, my friend who works at the bar upstairs told me that someone brought this pad to her, and he has some pretty schizophrenic thoughts in it. He has lots of stuff about how electric cars work to support some kind of government agenda surrounding social media, and some plans to patent for some sort of alternative energy source that involves the UN and foreign passports. Anyways, this part of the building is not under video surveillance, so I have no idea who left it, and if they were planning on coming back or not. But it could be the same guy from before. He seemed pretty unhinged, and definitely liked to spend a lot of time in weird parts of the building. I hope I don't meet that guy. So, I've been lurking this subreddit for quite a bit. I was under the impression that I didn't have anything to share with you, but an accident I conveniently tried to forget about just crossed my mind again. Please be patient with my writing, as I'm not a native English speaker. For 2.5 years now, I lived in a region that's near to the border of France. So near in fact, that I can just cross the border on weekends, take a ferry and go shopping for supplies there, considering beer, fish, cheese and the like are significantly cheaper than at home. So, that's what I did in the summer of 2015. A colleague had just recently showed me the way to a supermarket not far from the border. In a few days, I'd be going to a festival. I was determined to buy myself and the friends who had tagged along to the festival some of that cheap French beer. So, up to France I went. My shopping admittedly looked pathetic in the cart. Heaps of cheap beer in cans, water and some supplies I got for myself, shrimps mostly. Back home, they cost a fortune. In France, they're not even half the price of what they cost at home. I love shrimps, but I digress. So I go up to the cashiers and take a place in line. The guy in front of me turns around, takes a look at my shopping, and in a thick German-Russian accent he asks something along the lines of,
So, a young woman like you only buys that?
He's at least as old as my father, but my dad has aged fairly well, and that guy has thin, white hair and is as tall as me, which is not very tall. He looks just old, as if he could be my granddad in fact. When I'm confused, I tend to react politely, something that comes handy at my job, not so much in any other situation. So, this old man asks me about my shopping and adds,
Nothing for your boyfriend to buy?
Confused, I reply that I'm buying stuff for a festival that I'll be going to in a few days, and there is no boyfriend. That piques his interest even more, and then he tells me, just out of the blue,
There is a lake around here I like to go fishing to. Wanna see?
It's raining outside, what the hell? I decline. After all, I'll be off to my nice goth festival in a few days, and besides my beer, I have other stuff to pack or organize. He tries to make small talk, presses for me to visit that fucking lake with him. I'm even more weirded out. I don't even like fishing. When we're both done at the shop, I'm in a hurry to get away. I pull up to the ferry. Who pulls up behind me? I hope he hasn't noticed that I'm right in front of him, but of course he did. I don't stand a chance. Suddenly, he just opens the passenger side door and sits next to me. This old Russian guy just entered my car. I'm speechless. And then he tells me that he's disappointed. He had hoped that I would tag along to the lake for some fun. He made clear that he wanted sex. He tells me that normally, if he asked women in that supermarket to come to the lake, that wouldn't be a problem. I thoroughly decline. And this old man just stays in my passenger seat, tells me about his only son, who's older than me by the way, and is just incredibly awkward towards me. He smells like sour milk. I nestle with my phone, ready to call the police, and then the ferry arrives. He gets up, says goodbye, and enters his own car, a minivan. For a long time on the way back home, he's driving right behind me. I'm getting paranoid and even plan an escape route when he suddenly vanishes. I've never been back to that supermarket.